Thank you so much, Chairman Raskin, and thank you to all of our panelists here and our witnesses here today for your testimony and offering your insight. Before I begin, I would like to ask unanimous consent to submit to the record a Department of Justice report on hate crime victimization and a CNN article which summarizes the report.
Without objection.
Now, far too much of the discussion around the issue of white supremacist infiltration in policing focuses on whether this problem exists at all. And we have known for generations that it's not a question about whether this problem is an issue. It's a matter of how we have allowed it to sustain for so long. Congress as well has been complicit, and our silence has allowed for more violence and continued generational trauma in our communities. The question was raised by the ranking member earlier. Why do we keep talking about this? We keep talking about this because we have not solved this problem. And I want to make very clear that when we talk about systemic racism, we aren't litigating the individual attitudes of any one officer. We can all exist in racist systems, and you do not have to be racist or consciously racist in order to participate in these systems. And I think it's quite evident when you look at the outcome of the war on drugs. A systemic racism is about the laws that are on the books. It is about the types of enforcement that happens. It's about how many officers get designated to some communities more than others that yields racial disparities in their outcomes. It doesn't have to do with litigating each and every one individual officer. And that is really the issue that is at play. One of the things that I wanted to discuss is we have to stop asking about if white supremacy in policing exists. And I think we need to start figuring out how we can better determine the scale of this problem. How big is this issue? Mr. German, in your report, you write about the unbroken chain of law enforcement involvement in violent, organized racist activity right up to the present day. But you also note that only rarely do these cases lead to criminal charges. So why is that?
Thank you for the question. I believe it's difficult to prosecute police officers partly because of the way the civil rights laws are written and have been interpreted by the Supreme Court. So there's certainly room for Congress to work on that, but also for how the FBI investigates these crimes, where when there is an incident of alleged police brutality, the FBI will often investigate that very narrowly, much the way they do hate crimes. Are we able to prove that there is some kind of bias or intention to violate civil rights in this case, rather than looking comprehensively at that police officer's past to know whether that bias could be proven by other means. And then those cases are sent to Justice Department prosecutors, and the vast majority of them are declined for prosecution, so it becomes a matter of rote. FBI agents know that they just churn these cases out for declination.
Thank you. And Sergeant Taylor, in your decades-long career in law enforcement, how often would you see officers who harbored and acted on white supremacist views actually held responsible for their actions?
Very rarely. Very rarely. We have an officer that with COVID-19 who made a statement about Chinese Americans and COVID being spread in San Francisco, reported him, had a citizen report him decades before he had been disciplined for 30 days for using the N-word. And he's still on the street patrolling. So very rarely.
So we have testimony that this is a problem and it's not being it's systemically not being addressed. But Professor Johnson, I have one last question. I think it's important that we talk about the legal mechanisms by which kind of that perpetuate this issue. So let's talk about qualified immunity. How does the legal system in general, including qualified immunity, protect racist law enforcement officers from accountability? And how can we hope to evaluate the true spread of this problem given those barriers?
That's an excellent question. I think qualified immunity is certainly a barrier to holding police officers civilly liable. And then we also have the fact that interests align between police and prosecutors, because prosecutors depend so much on police officers to help make their cases. So you see a situation where, officers aren't being held responsible within their own ranks. They're not being held responsible by prosecutors, and they're not being held responsible through our civil courts. And so it's just a significant problem.
Thank you, Professor Johnson. Ms. Ocasio-Cortez, I now